folks, we dove into agency, right? Really in-depth agency conversations over the past couple evenings in class, and we're about to wrap up like the agency and brokerage relationship section, which will lead us into the agency contract section. And so we talked about single agency, we talked about dual agency, we talked about the working with real estate agents disclosure. Of course, early on in the agency section last week, we talked about material facts, the different categories of material facts. And so there has been a lot. And folks, we're going to build a bunch of different layers on this, but I've kind of started to warn you about how important language is in the agency questions, because you're not necessarily going to see the term dual agency on the test. You're going to see XYZ Realty and XYZ Realty, and you've got to piece together that's the same firm. You're also going to see things like the word selling agent, that is never going to tell you where your loyalties lie, and you're going to have to find words like customer or client that kind of explain to you who you're potentially working for. And as you saw, right, there are times where there are two brokerage firms, but it would still be exclusive seller agency. When would that arise? Two brokerage firms doing the deal together, but it's going to be exclusive seller agency. What do we call that?
Is that designated?
Because remember, dual is in-house transactions only. You cannot have dual unless the buyer and the seller are represented by the same firm. Bridge says, when the buyer doesn't want representation. And so the follow-up question I was going to give is, what do we call that? And Terry, you've got it. Seller subagency. More specifically, cooperating seller subagency. Because you're going to find out in the listing agreements today that if the seller and the listing firm decide it's okay, we can authorize a cooperating real estate firm to work on the same team. So it's called cooperating seller subagency. Don't forget, seller subagency can happen in-house as well, but you've got to make sure you understand where your loyalties lie. If somebody is assisting a buyer, but they're acting as a seller subagent, they're not loyal to the buyer in any way, shape, or form. They're loyal to the seller. So these are the things you've got to understand. And then, as we just mentioned, you can never, ever, 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 ever have dual agency if there are two brokerage firms. That is impossible. Okay? Dual agency is in-house transactions only. One firm representing the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Very specifically the same transaction. Not just a firm that represents buyers and sellers. Everybody with me? So we're going to get into some more agency stuff as we get into the agency contracts. But let's kind of derail, and we'll group this into agency. And this is another exceptionally testable thing, especially specifically in North Carolina. Folks, in North Carolina, we have something called the doctrine of caveat emptor. Okay? The doctrine of caveat emptor. And that is Latin, and it loosely translates to let the buyers beware. It sounds like something from the treasure map on the Goonies. Okay, have you ever seen that movie when like Mouth is reading it? And like it sounds exactly like that. Intruders beware. Let the buyer beware is what it sounds like. Or, I mean, it's what it sounds like, right? So let me explain what this means. This doctrine of caveat emptor. You're not going to like this, but you've got to burn this into your brains. What this doctrine states is a seller in North Carolina has next to zero obligations to disclose anything in regard to their property. Nothing. Zero. Zip. Nada. So this is a doctrine that has nothing to do with real estate brokers and everything to do with sellers and buyers. It is only between sellers and buyers. And so let me make sure you understand what I'm saying here. If the seller of a real estate property in North Carolina knows, Knows, knows that their roof leaks, they don't have to tell anybody. If the seller of a property in North Carolina knows that their foundation is crumbling and it needs $80,000 worth of work, they don't have to tell anybody. If the seller knows that there is a pit to hell in their basement that leads straight to the devil, they don't have to tell anybody. Folks, it doesn't matter how bad it is. Sellers in North Carolina do not have to disclose nothing to nobody. That's what the doctrine of caveat emptor states. Do not confuse this, though, with our broker's obligation to disclose material facts. So regardless of anything that the seller refuses to disclose, we as real estate brokers have a obligation to discover and disclose those reasonably ascertainable material facts. And so let me make sure you're tracking with me here. I'll give you an example test question. If I said the seller knows that their roof leaks, but does not disclose that roof leak, and their agent knows of the roof leak, and their agent doesn't disclose the roof leak, and the question is, who's in trouble? And it's going to say the seller, the seller's agent, both, neither. It's only the seller's agent. Because the seller's agent had a legal obligation to disclose that, because we are bound by disclosure laws where we have to disclose all reasonably ascertainable material facts and or things you know. But the seller is not in trouble if they don't disclose it. Sergio, you said you dealt with that firsthand where sellers didn't disclose things. Hopefully you found out some way, shape, or form. I hope. So...
I did find out. My roof was had some damage and a lot of shingles was removed. Nobody said anything, and we had a leak in the house or whatever. So I called to have an insurance claim done on it. They actually, the old owner actually went and done the entire insurance claim on the house. Took the check, took the money, and never repaired the roof. And then when I did it, they did it, and I had to change insurance because they dropped me. Because it was 2 claims were done within a year.
Yep.
So yes, I dealt with that first.
Yep. Now here's the thing, though, folks. And this is just a generalization. I'm going to introduce in just a second some disclosure forms. There are certain disclosure forms that are required in most transactions in North Carolina, but you will find that on these disclosure forms, there's questions that we want the seller to answer, and their options for answering are yes, there's an issue, no, there's not an issue, or no representation. And no representation is basically I plead the fifth, right? I remember old school Dave Chappelle, I plead the fifth, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, 5, right? I plead the fifth. That's the right to not self-incriminate, all right? You don't have to say nothing as a seller. And so understand the difference here. If a seller knows that their roof has an issue and they say no representation on the disclosures, they're not in trouble. They're saying, I'm not telling you, you figure it out. If a seller knows that their roof leaks and they put NO on the disclosure saying, no, I don't have an issue, they are liable for that because that is a misrepresentation or fraud. Okay? They're not allowed to commit fraud. They're not allowed to commit misrepresentation, but they are allowed to say, I'm not telling you nothing, neener, neener, boo-boo. So doctrine of caveat emptor is between sellers and buyers. Sellers do not have to disclose anything in any way, shape, or form. What you got, Raphael?
Okay. If the seller doesn't tell the agent, is the job of the agent to figure it out or find out?
If it is reasonably ascertainable. If it can be found out, yes, it's our job to find out.
Leaking, it's kind of,
Yeah, I mean, if there's water stains on the ceiling that we can see, we break that into 2 categories. It's what we call latent, can't discover, and patent or patent, depending on how you want to pronounce it, can be discovered. And so, these telltale signs like water stains would indicate that we need to ask some questions. Do you have a roof leak? And if they say it was repaired, do you have invoices? Can you prove it was repaired? So we have to discover and disclose. We got to ask questions. We got to inquire, try to figure these things out.
So should you be concerned if you see like a fresh paint in certain areas and like just I don't know, they trying to mask things up?
Yeah, that is what we call a red flag in the industry, where you would be prompted to ask more questions. Yeah. So the doctrine of caveat emptor is literally between the seller and the buyer, has nothing to do with us. And so because this, and it's a really old school doctrine, folks, let me clarify something. Some states, sellers are required to sing like a bird. They have to tell you legally anything and everything they know about their house. For whatever reason, North Carolina does not have that policy. And we have this doctrine of caveat emptor. Now, what we did to attempt to combat it, as opposed to getting rid of it, they created a piece of legislation called the Residential Property Disclosure Act. Okay, it's called the Residential Property Disclosure Act. And so what the Residential Property Disclosure Act ultimately did when this piece of legislation was passed is it created what we call a disclosure form. We call it the RPOADS for short. You see it on this list right here. Okay, RPOADS. That stands for Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement. We love our acronyms though, so we just call it the RPOADS. And then the other one is the MOG, which is a beautiful name, and it stands for the Mineral, Oil, and Gas Rights Disclosure. So the Residential Property Disclosure Act made these disclosure forms mandatory in most transactions. But while the forms themselves are mandatory, disclosure is not. And so these forms are required in residential transactions first and foremost. We define residential as 1 to 4 units. Anything in excess of 4 units is considered a commercial property, so 5-plex and bigger. And then there are certain exceptions to this as well. Now let me show you this form and let me explain the biggest pieces to this. Also, it's not super consequential. The form recently updated. It's not going to change anything for test taking purposes, but I'll show you the new one. Yeah, what you got?
What slide is this?
101. And the second grouping. So if you look, and this is obviously very North Carolina specific, under commission publications, disclosure forms, the Residential Property and Owners Association disclosure statement. This is what it looks like now, and I think the old version is still in your online program, but as I said, it's very inconsequential overall, the old version versus the new version for the sake of your test. But here's the way that this is structured. So it asks questions to the seller, like, is the property currently occupied? What year was the dwelling constructed? And the new version is just designed to be a little cleaner in overall. And you can see that their answer choices are yes, no, and no representation. And so the clarification is, if a seller says yes, they're saying yes, there's an issue. And they're expected to come in here and give us some information or some explanation on the issue they're disclosing. If they say no, they're saying they have no actual knowledge of an issue. But if they're lying, they can be held liable for committing fraud. And then if they say NR, that's no representation, that's I'm not telling you. And so they have every right to say I'm not telling you, even if they KNOW that there's an issue. No, there's an issue. And so there are certain exceptions for when this form does not have to be provided. And because this form is recently changed, all the things are kind of like hidden in here. So I'm just going to explain it to you. I don't know exactly where it is in this new form, but you are not required to provide one of these RPOADs, this form specifically, right? The Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement is exempt on new construction homes. Okay, somebody selling a new construction home like a builder does not have to provide you one of these. Foreclosures are exempt. Transfers between co-owners. A lease with option to purchase where the lessee already occupies the property. Those are really the only ones you need to know. And of course, commercial, because commercial is not residential. And so there is a requirement for the seller to fill this out when it's not exempt. And then it is every licensee's responsibility to facilitate getting this form to the potential buyer prior to the buyer making an offer. So I'm going to say it again. The form is mandatory, but the disclosure is not. In other words, the seller could, in theory, come in here and put no representation the entire way down. I'm not telling you, I'm not telling you, I'm not telling you, I'm not telling you. So can we all agree that this form could potentially even be, if it's given to you, could be worthless, right? There's a chance it could tell you nothing about the property because the seller could be like, I'm not saying nothing. Now, I'm going to explain something kind of loosely, and then this will make a resurgence later when we get into the contracts section. So, Lena, I'm sorry, just sorry question. What are the exemptions again? New construction, foreclosure, lease with option to purchase where the lessee already occupies the property. Keyword being lessee already occupies the property. If they're living there, they know what's wrong with it. You don't need to give them a disclosure. They can check it out. And then the last one that I said was transfer between co-owners or divorce, right? If you're signing over ownership to somebody else, you don't have to give them one of these.
Could you repeat that last one? Sorry.
Transfers between co-owners or divorce. So basically, if somebody's relinquishing their portion of ownership. So let me explain in a nutshell what happens. And as I said, you're not going to fully understand this yet, but I'm going to bring this back around later where you'll fully understand it. So just take it with a grain of salt right now. In North Carolina, we very often utilize what's called a due diligence style contract, which means when you get under contract, there is typically some money involved to give you a period of time to investigate the property, to decide if you want to move forward with the purchase or not. And if you decide not to move forward, you've still lost your due diligence money. So here's the key piece. Because this form is legally required, except in those times that I named as exemptions, if a buyer was to go under contract on a home and they have not received these, they basically get a 3-day out. They have the right to terminate the contract without penalties within 3 days of the effective date if they have not received this. And so that means they would get their due diligence money back when normally they would not for termination. That's kind of the special thing about this. And I'm going to explain that in greater detail when you fully understand contracts. You don't understand contracts yet, so I can only give you so much right now. Now, this is only one of the disclosure forms under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. The other one is the MOG, the Mineral, Oil, and Gas Rights Disclosure. Now, folks, very important here. The MOG is not exempt on new construction. This is still required on new construction where the ARPODES is not. You've got to know this. And in fact, I'll tell you how this form came about. For the longest time, the Residential Property Disclosure Act only had the ARPODES form. But what had happened was there was a builder out in Texas who was sneakily severing the mineral, oil, and gas rights from a property before they transferred title to it. And they kind of got in a little bit of trouble with the attorney general out there. And that builder started coming to build homes in North Carolina. And North Carolina basically said, And they created this disclosure form so that even builders would be obligated to disclose whether or not they have severed the mineral, oil, and gas rights. Now this one, you'll notice something different here. The seller does not have the option of no representation in regard to them. So the questions are, the mineral rights were severed from the property by previous owner. You can say no representation in regard to the previous owner. But seller has severed the mineral rights from the property. It's yes or no. Seller intends to sever the mineral rights from the property prior to transfer title. Yes or no. And then same thing here. Oil and gas rights are severed by the previous owner. You can say no representation there. But in regard to the individual owner, seller has severed them. Yes or no. Intends to. Yes or no. So if you think back to the lead-based paint disclosure that I showed you, both the MOG and the lead-based paint disclosure do not have the option of no representation in regard to the seller's disclosures. You have to answer. But the ARPODES, they can say, I'm not telling you nothing. Now, this is what I was talking about, and this is true of both the MOG and the RPODs. Yeah, there you go, Beverly. It's the same thing. It's either or, right? If either or of them was required and you didn't get it, it says, if the owner does not give you this MOG by the time you make the offer to purchase the property or exercise an option to purchase the property, you may, under certain conditions, cancel any resulting contract without penalty to you as the purchaser. And so, of course, you're going to see the language here. To cancel the contract, you must personally deliver a mail written notice of your decision to cancel to the owner or the owner's agent within 3 calendar days following the receipt of the disclosure statement, or 3 calendar days following the date of the contract, whichever occurs first. I'm not going to go too in depth with that yet because you're not going to fully understand it. Right now, just think you have 3 days after contract to terminate without penalties if you did not receive these. If you did receive them before you got under contract, nothing doing. But as I said, the way that the test questions are going to be structured around the doctrine of caveat emptor, it's going to say something like, the seller knows that they have, foundation issues. On the property disclosure, they answered no representation. And as I said, either the scenario is going to say the agent knew or didn't know. And so if it says the agent didn't know, is the seller liable or in trouble? No, because they don't have to disclose anything. If they knew and they lied, they'd be in trouble. And so let me give you another one. If the seller knows their roof leaks and puts NO in regard to the question on the roof on the RPODs, and then the agent also knows about the roof leak and fails to disclose it, who's in trouble, the answer now becomes both. Because the seller lied. Because they said no. No representation, they're not in trouble. Lying, they are. Everybody with me? The other kind of test question you're going to see is something along the lines of, and as I said, we're going to talk about this more when we get in the contract section, but something along the lines of, buyer is under contract to purchase 123 Main Street, but never received the disclosures prior to going under contract. Which of the following is true? And one of the options is going to say, buyer can terminate on day 2 after the effective date with no penalties because he never got the disclosures. That's going to be a true statement because they have that 3-day rescission period as long as they didn't receive them and as long as they were not exempt to potentially back out. Bill says, how often do the sellers and buyers disagree about mineral rights? Next to never. Next to never. It's not very common, especially depending on the area. Parker, elaborate. How can you prove that they knew? Oh, you're talking about the seller lies. You do bear the burden of proof. So let me give you an example here. Seller knows their roof leaks. On the property disclosure in regard to the condition of the roof, the seller says no issue. After closing on the property, the buyer learns from the neighbor that the previous homeowner has been just patching up the roof time and time again, never actually fixed it, and knew that it was still actively leaking. Now you've got testimonial from the neighbor stating that they very well knew, and you could potentially take them to court and sue them for damages with a witness. So you do bear the burden of proof. It can't be hearsay.
Gotcha. So you can't just, during due diligence period, they say, no, the roof's not leaking, but then during your inspection period, you find a leak.
Nope. I mean, at that point, you could terminate during a due diligence period, but you can't say without a doubt that the seller knew unless you have evidence that they knew. So very commonly, we find stuff because here's the thing, folks. How often do you think most sellers are crawling to the back corners of their crawl space before they list a house? Next to never. And so it's not uncommon for us to find things in the crawl space that they honestly didn't know about because they haven't been in there in a while. Yeah. What you got, Raphael?
You mentioned this finding out stuff in certain areas that you hardly go to. So who are supposed to go to those things and find out things like if you go under like the crawling space or if you go to the
home inspectors?
Okay, so you have to a broker has to have one of those guys coming in and checking it out. In
North Carolina, we are typically doing that during our due diligence period. And so that's where you got to be very cautious as to what you figure out about the property before you submit the offer, because there are things that you probably will not find out about the property until you're already under contract, like in Sergio's case. So you just got to be cautious. I mean, there's no one size fits all. Could we potentially negotiate a pre-contract inspection? Sure, but not common.
Yeah, because it recently happened to a friend of mine who got a house, and within 6 months during the summer now, the AC blew out. They said, "Oh, it's just gas, and it might need some gas," like the previous owner said.
Freon, yeah.
Then they charged him $500 to put gas. It ended up making a bigger mess because there was some sort of a leak of like at the roof or something. I don't know, one of those copper lines. And then he had to replace the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. And this is where I will remind you, I mean, that's unfortunate. And, there's a lot of, questions we could potentially discuss there. But I got to remind you, don't bring personal stuff into this class. You got to focus on what I'm teaching you. Because if you think about, like Sergio's case or your friend's case and, did somebody do something wrong, you're going to mess yourself up on the test. You just have to understand the literal interpretation, because that's the whole purpose of the due diligence period. Seemingly, you could have investigated things and found out during it before you close. And so if you didn't find it out, that's on the buyer at that point, right? That's actually the way that the doctrine of caveat emptor is written. It actually literally states that the sellers would only be responsible for disclosing things that were impossible. Literally use the word impossible to be discovered. And so if it's something that you could have had an inspection on, if it's something you could have evaluated during your due diligence period, they're not really held liable except for lying to you. Yeah. Bree says, how would you take them to court if you only have 3 days to prove it? You don't have only 3 days to prove it. You have 3 days to terminate, but you could take them to court after the fact. Also, you have that 3 days of protection for not receiving it, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't potentially have other reasons to get out of it because they lied to you or committed fraud. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. It's what we call lacking mutual assent. Basically, you were not given all the information that you're supposed to have, and so that could make a contract potentially voidable would be the word. But we'll get there in a little bit. So both the RPODs and the MOG are mandatory disclosures under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. Like I said, residential properties, 1 to 4 units, required on most transactions, exempt. The RPODs is exempt on new construction, foreclosures, transfers between co-owners, and lease with option to purchase where the lessee already occupies the property. Those are the main ones you need to worry about. Of course, we're going to talk about this again when we get into the contract section because of the right to get out of the contract. You'll understand it better at that point. One last thing to point out here, or I guess a couple last things to point out here. Folks, this is still required even if a seller is not using a real estate broker. So if a for sale by owner is selling their house for sale by owner, as a redundant, they are still legally obligated to provide these and would still have the buyer would still have the protections and the ability to get out if the seller doesn't provide them. Even though the seller doesn't know that they have to provide them, it's irrelevant. And when a broker is being used, it is the broker's responsibility to inform the seller of their duty to fill this out when required. I told you, it's every broker's responsibility to facilitate getting this form to the buyer before they make an offer. Okay, that's the deadline. Otherwise, that protection kind of kicks in. Also very important that we are not filling this out for them. You can see that on the test question. They have to fill it out themselves. We could help them understand some of the complex questions that are in there, but we are never filling it out for them. We are not telling them how to fill it out. None of that. They have to be the ones that fill it out.
Seth, is it considered like negligence on our behalf if we don't ensure that they get this before they go into contract?
No, it would not be considered negligence. Sometimes we just don't get it. I'll give you an example. Back in COVID time, when interest rates were low, there was a frenzy. All houses were like multiple offers. And so sometimes they went on the market so fast that the seller hadn't even finished filling these out yet. And if you wanted to compete with all the other offers coming in, you just had to submit it, even without these. And so sometimes it does happen, but you know, that's why that protection exists, because if you don't get it, you're going to want to make sure you get a copy so you can make some decisions on it within that 3-day protection. So same thing here, right? The MOG, both fall under this. Remember, the forms are mandatory when not exempt, but disclosure is optional, at least on the RPODs. Okay, at least on the RPODs. They can say no representation. I'm not telling. And they are not in trouble for not telling. They're just in trouble if they lie. So we're about to wrap up this section and move into agency agreements. Let me ask you a question first, though. Right here. Take a look at this question and tell me which one or more of these would be true. Getting some twos and threes. Folks, it is 2 and 3. Why? Because we're talking about buyer agency agreements specifically, and I told you oral buyer agency agreements are legal. But oral buyer agency agreements are non-exclusive and open-ended, and they would have to be reduced to writing prior to presentation of an offer on behalf of a buyer. So if we're putting in an offer, we need a written signed buyer agency agreement. So that's why 2 is true. And if we're trying to limit them to only work with us, that means we're looking to make it exclusive. That can also only be done in writing. Oral buyer agency agreements are never exclusive. And I am just yet again exceptionally thankful that none of you picked number 1, because I can't tell you how often students get trapped there because they're confusing agency agreements and agency disclosure, which are vastly different things. Remember what I told you yesterday. Agency disclosures never, ever, 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 ever create a relationship. They are just that, a disclosure, and that's it. How about this one? Seeing a lot of trues in the chat. True or false? A broker of ABC Realty finds out that a seller customer is moving to Canada in 2 weeks. Their broker is required to reveal this info to his buyer client. Folks, that is absolutely true, because we are dealing with a customer versus a client. I told you, you always have to disclose customer confidential information to a client, and you would never disclose client confidential information to a customer. Listen, I don't know if y'all know this, but y'all's teacher is pretty good. Okay, y'all actually learning some stuff. I don't know who he like knows. Just learning some stuff. I'm just absolutely impressed. How about this one? He's aight. Yeah, that's facts. He's aight. True's in chat again. True or false, an exclusive buyer's agency agreement is legally terminated once the buyer closes on the property. That is true. Remember we said, we started talking about agency agreements last week, and we said, okay, there's different ways for them to end. The best way for every contract to end is fulfillment of purpose. You did what you were supposed to do, it will end. Now there is one exception to this later, but in general, this is absolutely true. Which wraps up the overall discussion on brokerage. And of course, we're going to move into the more advanced side of things, which is our agency contracts, which are the documents that actually form the relationships. And so client is the person who hires us, also called the principal that we're working on behalf of, that we owe those fiduciary duties to. Customer is everybody else. We owe them honesty and fairness and disclosure of material facts. But really and truthfully, the honesty and fairness piece is telling them we'll screw them over if they let us. Dual agency is when the firm represents the buyer and the seller in the same transaction. Designated dual agency, sometimes just called designated agency, is a type of dual, never automatic. Okay? Even with 2 licensees, it's the worthless dual crap unless we give you language to understand that it's been turned into designated. Never called designated exclusive either, because it's not. The firm still represents both. It's just it acts like exclusive because one has been designated to represent the buyer and one has been designated to represent the seller, and now they can go for blood again. Of course, material facts, anything that if known could change the outlook of a party in completing the transaction. 4 different categories. We as real estate brokers always have to discover and disclose material facts. And then remember, sub-agent just means agent of the agent. But don't confuse that with the exceptionally specific thing that is seller sub-agency, which means everybody's loyalties are to the seller. Could be in-house seller sub-agency, could be cooperating seller sub-agency. Both exist. Whoop whoop.